Category 1. Pinching the earbud.
Pinching earbud for 300.
This action is accomplished using the concentrically contracted pronator teres and pronator quadratus at the proximal and distal radial ulnar joint using 0 to 80 degrees of range of motion.
What is forearm pronation? Pinching earbud for 200.
During elbow extension, which uses concentrically contracted triceps and anconeus, the range of motion is this at the elbow joint. What is 75 to 60 degrees? Let's do pinch for 100. The joint action of shoulder flexion at the glenohumeral joint ranging 30 to 40 degrees uses this muscle during concentric contraction.
What is anterior deltoid? Pinch for 500.
These joints are used in the finger flexion of digits 1, 0 to 20 degrees, digits 2 and 3, 0 to 30 degrees, during concentric contraction of the flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor digitorum profundus, and opponent pollicis. What is the IP of digit 1 and the pip and dip of digits 2 and 3? Pinching for 400. This type of muscle contraction is used while flexing the wrist 0 to 15 degrees at the flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris.
What is concentric contraction?
Category 2. Raise earbud to ear.
How about raise to ear for 100?
Try not to distract you.
During elbow flexion, these three muscles are concentrically contracted and have the range of motion of 60 to 150 degrees. What is biceps, brachyradialis, and brachialis? Raise to ear for 300. This action occurs when the flexor carpi radialis, longus and brevis, and the extensor carpi radialis are concentrically contracted at the wrist joint at 0 to 30 degrees.
What is wrist radial deviation? Let's do raise for 400.
This type of contraction occurs when digits 1 through 3 are flexed using the opponent pollicis, flexor digitorum superficialis, and flexor digitorum profundus at the ip, pip, and dip joints. What is concentric contraction? Raise to ear for 200. These joints are involved when the forearm returns to neutral using the eccentrically contracted pronator teres and pronator quadratus from 80 to 0 degrees.
What is proximal and distal radio-ulnar joint? Raise to ear for 500.
The range of motion during concentric shoulder flexion of the glenohumeral joint that uses the anterior deltoid.
What is 40 to 45 degrees?
Category 3. Stick earbud in ear.
Stick earbud in ear for 100. These muscles are eccentrically contracted during forearm pronation at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joint.
What is supinator?
What is the pronator teres and pronator quadratus? Let's do stick in ear for 200.
The range of motion that occurs during wrist radial deviation that uses the concentrically contracted flexor carpi radialis longus and brevis and extensor carpi radialis.
0 to 30 degrees.
What is 0 to 10 degrees? Stick in ear for 400.
During shoulder flexion, the anterior deltoid is concentrically contracted and has a range of motion of 45 to 90 degrees at this joint.
What is the glenohumeral joint? Let's do stick in ear for 500.
The muscles of the biceps, brachialis, and brachioradialis used in elbow flexion from 60 to 130 degrees use this type of contraction.
What is concentric contraction? Stick earbud in ear for 300.
This action is done by the concentric contraction at the flexor digitorum superficialis, the flexor digitorum profundus, and the opponens pollicis at the ip, the pip, and the dip. What is finger flexion of digit 1 through 3?
Category 4. Adjust earbud into place.
Let's do adjust the earbud for 200.
During finger flexion, in which the flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor digitorum profundus, and opponens pollicis are concentrically contracted at the ip, pip, and dip, the range of motion achieved is this. What is 0 to 20 degrees of digit 1 and 0 to 30 degrees of digits 2 and 3? Let's do adjust for 300. This action is completed using the concentrically contracted anterior deltoid at the glenohumeral joint from 45 to 90 degrees. What is shoulder extension?
What is shoulder flexion? Let's do adjust for 500.
The pronator teres and pronator quadratus in the forearm at the proximal and distal radial ulnar joint with the range of motion of 0 to 80 degrees have this type of contraction.
What is eccentrically contracted?
What is isometric contraction? Let's do adjust for 100, please. These three concentrically contracted muscles are used during wrist radial deviation of 0 to 10 degrees.
What is the flexor carpi radialis, longus and brevis, and the extensor carpi radialis? Let's do adjust for 400.
During flexion, the bicep, brachialis, and brachioradialis concentrically contracted from 60 to 130 degrees of motion at this joint.
What is the elbow joint?
Category 5, releasing the earbud.
Let's do release the earbud for 300.
During this joint pose, the biceps, brachioradialis, and brachialis are concentrically contracted at 130 degrees.
What is elbow flexion? Let's do release for 400.
The range of motion when the forearm is in neutral with the help of the isometrically contracted pronator teres, pronator quadratus, and supinator at the proximal and distal radial ulnar joint. What is 0 degrees? Let's do release for 200. During shoulder flexion at the glenohumeral joint with the range of motion of 45 to 90 degrees, the anterior deltoid has this type of contraction.
What is concentric contraction? Let's do release the earbud for 100.
These muscles are eccentrically contracted during finger flexion at the ip, pip, and dip with a range of motion of 80 to 0 degrees. What is flexor digitorum profundus, flexor digitorum superficialis, and opponens pollicis? Let's do release for 500. The flexor carpi radialis, longus and brevis, and extensor carpi radialis are eccentrically contracted and have a range of motion of 10 to 0 degrees at this joint.
What is the wrist joint? This award-winning professor at Dominican University of California taught 23 occupational therapy students the subject of human movement analysis.
Who is Shad St. Louis?
Who is Jane Dressler?
Who is Shad St. Louis?
Yeah! Woo! Congratulations, Caitlin. Say hi to camera. Wave.
Do do do